Okay, while people are still rolling in, I'll just make a quick introductory remark and then turn it over to my colleagues. My name is Professor David Brodsky. I'm the chairperson of the Department of Judaic Studies. And today I am tech support. So I will be turning this over from here to my esteemed colleague of early modern Judaism, Professor Sharon Flato, who will be making the rest of our introductory remarks. Thank you. Sharon, you're muted. Can you unmute yourself, or do you need me to permit you to? Okay.
Okay, now I know how my students feel. First of all, I wanted to thank you all for joining today in the middle of your busy work weeks, in the middle of a busy work week. I also wanted to begin by acknowledging our gratitude to Frances Haidt, who was a alum of Brooklyn College from the class of 44. So if any alum are thinking of projects. Frances worked and published in finance, and of particular relevance to us today is that she generously endowed this annual lecture in Jewish studies. Her nephew, Jonathan Haidt, has attended these lectures in the past. I don't know if he's here today. If you are, send us a message. But due to the pandemic, we obviously can't host him. But we look forward to doing that in future years. But in any case, we just wanted to say thank you for the family grant, which has enabled us to hold this wonderful event. And today we have the particular privilege of hearing from Moshe Rosman as our Haidt lecturer. Moshe, who's to the left of me, I don't know where he appears on your screen, is a distinguished professor of Jewish history at Bar Ilan University. The truth is, Moshe probably needs no introduction for many of you, but here I'm doing it anyway. His areas of expertise include Polish Jewish history, Hasidism, and Jewish historiography. He will be speaking about Hasidism next lecture. I kind of twisted his arm and said, we want to hear about Hasidism. He is the author of several trailblazing books, including The Lord's Magnate, published by Harvard, the founder of Hasidism, A Quest for the Historical Baal Shem Tov, How Jewish is Jewish History. He is also an important contributor to a large tome, and I mean a large tome, on Hasidism, which recently appeared, Hasidism, A New History, which draws on the paradigm-shifting research done in the past few decades, including, of course, of his own. Always engaged in new projects, Professor Rosman is currently working and almost finishing a book, which is called Categorically Jewish, Distinctly Polish, also published by Littman Press, which is also dear to my heart because they're my publishers. By now, you may not be surprised to hear that Moshe has also been the recipient of numerous prestigious awards, including the National Book Award and most recently the Rothschild Prize. On a personal note, I can't even remember when I first met Moshe. I think I really first met Moshe through his writings. They were always the cutting edge research. We read his writings and Zev Grease and how things were more popular than we realized. And when I was a graduate student at Yale. And then when I finally started, going and presenting at conferences, I've met Moshe a few times. He was the chair of my panel. And at those conferences, I was always struck not only by his brilliance, but also by his humility, and particularly by his encouragement of young scholars, which, if you know academia, and maybe even if you know especially Judaic studies, that is not always the case. So I'm particularly grateful to Moshe for that. So without further ado, I present Moshe, who's going to be speaking about gender bending in the early modern period.
Thank you very much. Good evening from here in Jerusalem, where it is 7:30 in the evening. I want to begin by thanking Professor Flato for inviting me to give these lectures, and Professor Brodsky for serving as our tech man, and to all of you for tuning in. So we're going to speak about three women tonight who lived in three different centuries, 16th, 17th, and 18th. The first one is Beyla Falk. She lived in southeastern, what was then Poland, Lviv, today Lviv. We don't have any picture of her. She didn't write anything. She was the daughter of Yisrael Idols, who was a wealthy businessman and a communal leader. Her husband was what I call a member of the all-time rabbinic all-star team. That is Rabbi Yehoshua ben Alexander Falk, who wrote several works. The two most famous are the Drisha Uprisha, which you see the title page of here, which is a commentary on parts of the Arba Turim law code, and Mirat Einayim, which is a commentary on part of the Code of Jewish Law, the Shulchan Aruch. Her son, Yosef Yospe Falk, wrote an introduction to his father's book when he published it, this Drisha Uprisha. And at the end of the introduction, he devoted a very long paragraph to praise of his mother. So here is the son's tribute to his mother. Her splendor, majesty, and glory not only shined upon us, but on all of her generation. She was the glory of all the daughters of Israel. Jewish daughters saw her. They affirmed her pleasant deeds and prestige. She guided them in the right path. All daughters of Israel should learn from her example. Now, he didn't just give fluorescent praise. He gave us facts to back up why she should serve as an example. And she is our first example of a woman. What makes for a religious, pious example of a woman in the 16th, early 17th century? First of all, she fulfilled various mitzvot, commandments. We know that she facilitated her husband's and his students' Torah study, and the Talmud says the way a woman gets mitzvah points, the way she gets reward, is by facilitating her husband's study and her son's study. And this is a theme that runs through the halacha, I would say all the way up till today. Well, Yosef tells us that she did this. Secondly, she made a point of visiting mourners and visiting the sick, two very important mitzvot. He tells us that she gave more charity, more tzedakah, than she could afford. She came to the synagogue every day to the women's section. She had the key to the women's section, and she opened the door and she stayed there for at least 2 hours. And finally, after her husband died, several years later, she made aliyah to the land of Israel. She immigrated to Israel, and she lived out her days in prayer and study and visiting the graves of righteous people. So that's the first thing that makes her a model. She observed mitzvot, but that's not it. That's not all. She also performed what I would call para mitzvot. First of all, she made tzitzit, the ritual fringes that men have to wear on special garments. She also made the gid, that is the thread made out of animal sinew that's used to sew together the columns of the Torahs. She also weaved talitot, prayer shawls, to which you would affix tzitzit. And she made kittles, that is white cloaks that many men would use to pray, would pray in and put their talit on top of. And she would pray, as I already mentioned, an extra long time. See, these are not exactly mitzvot. These are not things that people have to do, but these are things that support the performing of mitzvot. But then there's another category of behavior, and that is what I call sacralizing the mundane, taking everyday actions, but assigning to them a sacred value, making them kadosh, holy. So he tells us she was ascetic. Even though her father was rich and she was an only daughter, we don't know if she was the only child, but at least we know she was the only daughter, and she could have lived in luxury. She rejected luxury all her life. And she was vegan. Not only was she vegan, she wouldn't even eat fruit. And she frequently fasted. Now, these are things you don't have to do, but that lend what I would call a sacred halo to your life. She also refused to waste time. She was very humble. And he praises her as if it is a religious obligation for that she cared for her children, her grandchildren, and even other people's children. How did she care for them? She taught them, she fed them, she laundered their clothes, and she shampooed their hair for Shabbat. And last but not least, she cooked wonderful Shabbat meals, both for her own family and for the poor. So here we have a model of women's piety. But then he goes one step further. And here's where the gender bending comes in, not the bending of the gender, but of the gender boundary. There are several things she did that her son says she did like a man, como gever. And what were those things? First of all, she would study the Parshat HaShavua, the Torah reading of whatever week it was, with the commentaries. And at those meals that she served to her husband and his students, she would also give a Devar Torah, that is a homiletic dissertation, a sermon based on the Torah reading. And he says that she was almost like a Baal Hora'ah, that is almost like a halachic authority. And how is that? Because she mastered Dinei Nashim and Hilchot Nida. She mastered laws pertaining to women and all the laws pertaining to the female biological cycle. And she taught those to women. And she also crusaded, if that's the word I can use in this context, against what she realized was a mistaken candle lighting custom in her time. And this was that women on holidays would light the candles like you light the Shabbat candles. Shabbat candles, the way they are lit is the woman first lights the candles, then she covers her eyes, makes the blessing, the bracha, and then opens her eyes. And the reason for this is that once she makes the blessing, she has accepted the Sabbath. And so she wouldn't be able to light the candles anymore. So she lights the candles, does not benefit from them, does not use them, says the blessing, and then accepts Shabbat. But on holidays, you are allowed to use fire. And so you should first say the blessing and then light the candles. But he tells us that in her time, many women still lit candles on holidays like Shabbat, and she fought against this. Okay, our second woman is much more famous. She's known as usually Glikl of Hamel, and I think that's mainly because people like the idea of associating her with a certain Pied Piper. She actually, her husband was from Hamlin or Hamel, and she lived there about 2 years, but most of her life she lived in Hamburg. As you see, she was born in 1645 and died in 1724. Again, we do not have a picture of her. The picture on the poster for the lectures that you saw is a picture of a descendant of hers, Bertha Pappenheim, who also was a famous patient of Freud, who dressed up as if she were Glikl in the 17th century. She did that around 1900. What we do have from Glikl is these two lines that she signed herself in the ledger book of the Hamburg community, in which she says, today, Sunday, the 21st of Tevet, that was 1697, I, Glikelchen, widow of Reb Chaim Hamel, Segal, paid my balance, that is, she paid her taxes, thus I owe nothing more. So here we have Glikl existing, but she also wrote her memoirs, and that's what made her famous. She wrote in Yiddish Deutsch, in Yiddish, a book which is a combination autobiography, ethical will. She says she intended it for her children and her descendants, although we know that other women wrote things like this, and they were usually available for people outside the family to read as well. This is a fascinating book. I'm not going to get into it now. We have an excellent edition that came out recently, first in Hebrew and then in English. It was edited by Chava Turnyansky. And the English version was translated by Sarah Friedman. And here we have two 17th century German Jews. Gives you an idea of what Glikl might have looked like. Now, Glikl's book has what I consider to be a dual narrative. There is the convention, a narrative of convention, and there is the narrative of reality. So part of the book, she is spouting all sorts of pieties that she feels her children should be loyal to, but much of the book, she also gives her very unsentimental view of life. So for example, Glikl on Human Nature, she says, whenever an opportunity arises for a person to utterly ruin another, she's talking about business, it is seized gleefully. Don't give a sucker, nobody gives us the other guy a break. We human beings understand nothing of each other's sorrow. Everyone thinks his own sorrow is the greatest. Everyone feels sorry for themselves. So this gives you an idea of Glikl's very clear-eyed, unsentimental way of dealing with life. So what did Glikl have to say about being a woman? Well, you know, in the Jewish prayer book, the Siddur, the morning blessings that people are supposed to say every day, a man says, blesses God for not having been created a woman. And I'm not going to get into all the explanations of that. And women say they bless God for having been created according to his will. And the juxtaposition of these two blessings make it seem like the women's blessing is a kind of consolation prize. Well, Glikl says pretty much the same thing, but in the context of her book, it does not seem like a consolation prize, but rather that she's proud. I thank and praise my creator that he created me as he desired and saw fit. And I feel like she's saying to the men, so there. My father provided an education in the ways of heaven, as well as in the ways of the world, to both his sons and his daughters. So she's telling us she is educated. We already saw she can read and write. If you read the book, you see that she has a great fund of knowledge, Jewish and otherwise. And as we'll see, she was a very sharp and successful businesswoman. Glikl tells us that women's lives matter. I gave birth every 2 years. Glikl had 14 children. 12 of them lived till maturity, which in the 17th century is amazing. We would expect something like half of them to die in childhood. She tells us, I gave birth every 2 years and worked very hard, as is the way of anyone with a household with children. So don't dismiss women's work. This is hard work. And then at one point, she tells an anecdote. I'm not going to get into the details, but at the end, she says, from this, we see that what women desire is not pure stupidity. And then she tells us about a relative of hers who was married to a very wealthy man and greatly influenced the way he spent his money, also influenced him to adopt a child. Beyla knew how to guide the heart of her husband. In other words, Beyla is the person who made decisions. Now, in our time, we talk a lot about objectification. Well, Glikl tells a long story about how she was visiting her in-laws in Hamel, and her husband, Chaim, was doing business in Hamburg, and he sent for her. By the way, at the time, the reason she went to Hamelin is because there was a plague in Hamburg, and most of the people tried to leave the city. So her husband sent for her, and he sent a man named Yaakov to accompany her, to be a chaperone, to protect her and the children who were with her. Well, as they were getting ready to go, one of the men there, I'm sorry, the story with Yaakov is later. This is a different story. It was Chaim and Glikl were together in Hanover and had to travel back home to Hamburg. And there was a war going on. There were highwaymen, and it was dangerous. So Chaim tried to prepare for the dangerous journey. His friend Meir said to him, "My dear Reb Chaim, why are you so worried? And why are you making your wife dress so hideously?" In other words, he dressed her up in very tattered clothes. My husband answered, "God knows I'm not worried about myself or the money I'm carrying. It's the women folk I'm worried about, my wife and the maidservant." So Meir says to him, "No need to worry. Seriously, Reb Chaim, you are wrong about your wife. You should not have made her dress so hideously. Nobody would have harmed her anyway." And then Glikl tells us, my husband was very angry at Reb Meir's joking and took it very much to heart. So Glikl is telling us that this Meir called her ugly. But she doesn't comment on it. She couldn't care less. It was her husband that got upset. She's reporting her husband's reaction. As far as she's concerned, this is the men's problem, not hers. She also tells us about many women who have agency. For example, her mother, she tells us, had some business with an advocate who lived in the horse market in Hamburg. On the holiday of Shavuot in 1715, there was a panic in the women's section of the synagogue. There was a loud noise, and the word spread that it was a balcony, that the balcony was going to collapse, and women started rushing to get out, and there was a crush, and 6 women were trampled to death. In response to this, among the things that were done, Glikl tells us, righteous women established a Psalms recital society, hiring 10 scholars to go to the synagogue every day at 9 a.m. to say Tehillim and study. Now, it's true the women didn't do it themselves, but the fact is they took the initiative and they arranged for it to be done. Or she tells us that when she and Chaim had to arrange a journey under difficult circumstances, the widow, Breinele, was a most devout, wise woman. She did all she could to help us continue on our journey, hiring a carriage and getting a guard and making sure that they could go. Now, in her book, Glikl has heroes and villains. And it so happens that all of the villains are men and all of the heroes are women. Except, I should say, her husband. He's also a hero. But many of the other heroes are women. So one story she tells is that her father had been married before to a woman who had been married before and had a daughter. And her father adopted this daughter, whose name she doesn't tell us. And it so happened that she knew how to speak French and she knew how to play the piano. So Glikl's father, among other things, lent money. And he lent a very large sum of money to Christian in Hamburg, and he took a pawn as security. The man came with a friend of his, ostensibly to pay back the money and to collect his pawn. So Glikl's father went to the room when he kept the valuables to fetch the pawn. In the meantime, the stepdaughter was playing the piano to entertain the guests. And they started speaking in French. And they said, when the Jew comes back with our pledge, we'll grab it without giving him the money and get out of here. Well, she heard this. And when her stepfather came back in the room, she started singing, no money, no pledge. He got the idea and he said to them, let's see the money first. And they realized, she yelled, or she sang, beware, not the pledge, today here, tomorrow gone. And they realized we've been duped. The whore must know French. And they left. The next day, the man who took the loan came back and paid in full. Or another hero, this is a map of Hamburg in the 17th century. In a period of 3 years, 2 Jewish moneylenders disappeared. And excuse me, not moneylenders, but Wechsel, money changers disappeared. And all that was known about them was in each case, a woman came to them and said, come with me. There's a merchant who just came to town and he has gold and jewelry to sell. Bring with you a lot of cash and you can buy what he has to sell and then sell it at a profit. Well, this woman named Rivka, due to certain things that I can't get into now, thought she knew what happened, that this woman was the servant of a certain son of an innkeeper, and that it was that son of the innkeeper who stole these men's money and killed them. And she carried on a kind of investigation, which eventually led to the arrest and punishment of the son of the innkeeper. And they were able to find the bodies of the 2 men so that their wives could remarry. So another woman hero. And then Glikl herself is a hero. Her husband, Chaim, died at a young age. He was in his 40s, on his deathbed, the people tending to him asked for instructions. He replied, "My wife, she knows everything. She should continue just as she was doing before." In other words, we're partners. We run the business together. She knows it. She knows everything that has to be known. And then Glikl says, "It is not to praise myself that I mention that he took advice from no one but me and did nothing until we had talked it over. Though my husband did not want to tell me about a certain bad business deal that he made, he could not keep it from me. I said to my husband, we can try it for 1 year, talking about signing a contract with someone. I will draft a short agreement and see how it suits you." So she was the one who drafted the contract. And then the story that I told you by mistake before about Yaakov, who was supposed to accompany Glikl with her children from Hamelin to Hamburg. Well, they started going with the post coach. And at one point, Yaakov, who she indicates was evidently an alcoholic, wanted to stop for a drink. And he said he would catch up with the coach. Well, they never caught up. And they got to wherever they were going to spend the night, and no Yaakov. So she sent out villagers to look for him. And here's what happened. 2 villagers found my Yaakov as good as dead, faint with travel and drunkenness. His money, all gone. So the villagers brought him to the inn. Despite being furious with him, I thank God upon seeing him again. It cost me more than 7 Reichstaler. She had to pay the villagers. I gave him something to eat. So my fine servant, who was supposed to be taking care of me and my children, I wound up taking care of him instead. And here we have a picture of the marketplace in Hamburg. And she tells us, I was doing a brisk business in the fabric trade, selling 500 or 600 Reichtalers worth of goods a month. I attended the Braunschweig fair twice a year, making several thousand at every fair. My fabric business was doing very well indeed. I imported merchandise from Holland and purchased a large quantity of merchandise in Hamburg too. I had my own fabric store. Winter and summer, I traveled constantly on the go. In addition, I dealt in ounce pearls, which I would buy from the Jews. Then I would sort them and resell them wherever I knew there was a demand. I had an extended line of credit. If I wanted to make 20,000 Reichstaler banco during a single bourse session, I could do it. So, Glikl is an activist. Glikl has agency. Glikl has confidence. Glikl does what she needs to do, what she wants to do. And when you read her book, or at least when I read the book, the question comes up to me, does Glikl think that women really need men? She gives us several examples that raise this question. My sister-in-law Yente remained a widow for several years, unwilling to remarry since she was a young, energetic woman. What does she need a man for? When my father died, my mother was 44 years old. She had opportunities for many good matches and could have remarried and had great wealth again, but she never wanted that, preferring instead to remain a widow. If God punishes a woman and she loses her first husband, may the good Lord also give her this thought. My mother remained thus in her dignified widowhood. And of course, in the 17th century, the women who had the most autonomy were affluent widows. And then about herself, Glikl tells us, after Chaim died, many matches had indeed been proposed to me, the most prestigious in all Ashkenaz. But as long as I thought I could manage to live on the little that my husband left me, I never even considered changing my status. But fine.
I'm sorry, Moshe, it's my fault. As I'm clicking on entering people, I accidentally muted you.
Okay.
It's hard. I'm admitting people, and then it moved, and so go ahead, repeat
Okay.
the last few words.
After Chaim died, she resisted all sorts of proposals of marriage, saying that she didn't see how marrying anybody who proposed would benefit her children. Finally, the richest man in Alsace, Hertz Levy, proposed to her, and her children encouraged her to marry him. And she thought that this indeed would help her children, marrying the richest Jew in Alsace. And so she traveled to Metz to marry Hertz Levy. And she tells us the following: my husband's valet came in with the maidservant, bearing 2 big gold-plated trays, one with the fanciest desserts, the other with the choicest fruits. Lying on top was a gold chain with a gold bar and 2 large gold-plated goblets filled with wine. This was my Sabbath fruit. It was exquisite. However, Hertz Levy had the chutzpah to go bankrupt. He lost everything. And so Glikl tells us, but oh dear Lord and Maker, that gold chain turned literally into shackles and bands of iron. I had to fall into the hands of a man. And she says what she should have done was to marry off her youngest daughter. Remember, there were 12 altogether. And after Chaim died, there were still 8 that needed to be married off, and she married off all of them. So she says she should have married off her youngest daughter and then gone to the land of Israel and lived there as a pious woman. Our third woman is Sarah, Rivka, Rachel, Leah Horowitz, known to her family and friends as Leah Horowitz. She was probably born in the 2nd decade of the 18th century and lived at least through the 1780s, also in Southeast Poland. Again, we have no picture. We do have one testimony about her. We have the memoirs of a wine merchant, Dov Ber of Bolechov, who tells us that when he was 12 years old, he used to go to the rabbi every Shabbat to learn Talmud. The rabbi would open the Talmud, show him a passage, and say, okay, I'm going to take my nap. You prepare this passage in the Talmud, and I'll test you when I come back. Well, Dov tells us he really didn't know how to study Talmud, but to his great fortune, who would be sitting there but the rabbi's sister, and that is Leah Horowitz. And he tells us she would teach him the Talmud with the commentaries by heart. So she was an unusually learned woman. Her father was a rabbi. Her brothers were rabbis. She married in succession 2 different rabbis. Now, Leah Horowitz wrote a small booklet called Tchina Imahot, the Tchina of the matriarchs. This booklet is in 3 parts, in 3 languages. There is a Hebrew introduction. There is an Aramaic piyut, kind of poem, and a Yiddish techina. A techina is a supplicatory prayer, often said by women, usually in private or semi-private circumstances, in the mikveh, the ritual bath, at the cemetery, when lighting candles, if somebody in the family is sick, if the husband is going on a trip. But this techina, written by Leah Horowitz, was intended to be recited in the synagogue on the Shabbat before the new moon, what's called Shabbat Nevorchin, the Shabbat, the Sabbath, in which we bless the coming new moon, the coming new month. So the Yiddish techina is to be said by the women when the men are saying the Hebrew prayer. The first part, the introduction in Hebrew, is obviously addressed to the rabbis. The second part, in Aramaic, which is roughly parallel to the Yiddish techina, I think Leah was just showing off. She was saying to the rabbis, look, I can do it too. I can write a prayer in Aramaic. How many men in the 18th century could understand Aramaic, let alone write in Aramaic? So there's much to say about this booklet, but we don't have much time. Here we have a picture of Chaika and Elia Lvovsky, two affluent Jewish women of the 18th century, to give you an idea of how women might have been dressed. This was painted in 1781. So Leah is making a proposal, a new paradigm for women as model. Toward the beginning of her Hebrew introduction, she says, surely the legitimacy of women's prayer does not escape any clear-eyed person, and I will not speak to dullards. So here we have a woman, unlike Beyla, she is speaking for herself. It's not her son talking about her. Unlike Glikl, she's not writing for her family. She is writing for the intellectuals of the time, for the rabbis, the people who she's saying shouldn't be dullards. And she, like Mary Wollstonecraft, who was a younger contemporary of Leah living in England, who emphasized in her book that she was appealing to rational men, Leah too is appealing to rational men. What does not escape any clear-eyed person. Now, Leah lived in the 18th century. She's from a rabbinical family, and she's a woman of her time. She is familiar with the stereotypes about women. So, for example, she says, women are talkative, gossiping in the synagogue on the Sabbath. She doesn't, later on, she implies men don't talk any less. Women cry. Women talking rather than praying in the synagogue arouse jealousy, even in such an awesome place. When she gets home, a woman argues with her husband over finery. Maybe she saw Chaika Lvovsky. You saw how she was dressed with her jewelry. She says, in the synagogue, I should be outfitted as beautifully as so-and-so. On the other hand, Leah, who was very learned, reminds us of Rav Acha's maxim in the Talmud. It is only by the merit of women that the generations are redeemed. That is the redemption. The Messianic age, the Messiah, will only come when women deserve it, when the merit is the merit of women. They will bring the redemption. They will bring the return to Eretz Yisrael. So Leah now plays devil advocate. This is surprising. Placing the permanent residents, that is men, down on the ground, and the strangers, that is women, in the highest heaven? How can that be? Why is it women's merit, not men's merit? In his own home, even a weaver is a satrap. A man's home is his castle. And she also notes that a proper woman obeys her husband. But given all of this, she comes back to the idea that it's women's merit that brings redemption. And then she advocates how women can indeed merit. And in this way, she's not a woman of her time. First of all, she says, women are entitled to engage in Torah. She says, referring to her writing this prayer, even though it is not often that a woman engages in Torah discourse, quote, the crown of Torah is set out for all of the inhabitants of the world. That's what the Talmud says, and that includes women. Moreover, she advocates on Shabbat, rather than gossip, they should speak words of Torah and study, each according to his ability. Moreover, those men incapable of study and women should read in Yiddish, their language, the colloquial language. So they will also understand how to serve God. They must know how to keep the mitzvot, the commandments that apply to them that God has set forth. So women should study Torah. Next, women should participate in public prayer. Women's participation in public prayer is legitimate and essential. In the book of Jeremiah, chapter 31, it states, when God gathers Israel from the ends of the earth, they shall come with weeping. In other words, the redemption will come out of crying. Well, who cries better than women? You need women in the synagogue to cry during the prayers. That's their job. So they should be in the synagogue. A person's prayer is only heard in the synagogue. Therefore, since the day of the Lord is near, it is proper that our women come to the synagogue morning and evening to pray with copious tears. So women belong in the synagogue no less than men. Third, you remember that Beyla's son Yosef praised her for facilitating the study of her husband and his students. Leah wants to say women are not only facilitators. And she does this in a very original way. Now, Rambam, Maimonides, in his Sefer HaMitzvot, the Book of the Commandments, tells us that after the destruction of the temple, there are only 425 commandments. Normally we talk about 613 commandments. But after the destruction of the temple, all of the commandments pertaining to sacrifices and the temple fall away. So in our time, there are 365 negative commandments and 60 positive commandments that apply to individuals. Altogether, 425 commandments that every individual male Jew has to observe. There is a halakhic ruling that women are exempt from all positive commandments that depend on time, things that have to be done at a certain time, such as saying the Shema prayer, or sitting in the Sukkah on the holiday of Sukkot, or saying the blessing over the lulav on Sukkot, or wearing tzitzit, which is you do during the day. So women are exempt from positive commandments that are time connected. How many of those are there? Well, according to Rambam, Leah tells us, there are only 14 commandments that women are exempt from. So if men have to observe 425 commandments, women only have to observe 411, and not only 3 commandments, as many people think. So women have a full complement of religious obligations, not materially inferior to that of men. So let's look at our 3 women. Let's talk about what's the proper way for a woman to behave. So Beyla, I think, would have told us women should behave as women are supposed to behave. That is, there is behavior appropriate to each gender, and you shouldn't behave otherwise. Glikl, I think, would say women should behave however they need to behave and want to behave. And that's what she did. And Leah is telling us women should behave as Jews. Well, what about women's mitzvot? Beyla was an expert in women's mitzvot. And which mitzvot were those? The mitzvot pertaining to the biological cycle, to lighting candles, and I assume the third classical woman's mitzvah, separating a piece of dough when baking the challah. She was an expert in those women's mitzvot. And Glikl doesn't say much about mitzvot, but I assume that she also subscribed to the idea of the 3 special women's mitzvot. Leah, I believe, would have said, no, women have to perform the Jewish mitzvot, 411 of them, not just 3. Now, Beyla shows us with her behavior that exceptional women can behave occasionally like men. As her son tells us, like a man, she would give Torah lessons. Like a man, she would teach halakha. Like a man, she would correct improper customs. So she was exceptional, and that was okay. Glikl shows us many times in her book, women need not measure themselves against men. Women have nothing to answer for to men. And Leah shows us that women are as significant religiously as men are. So I think Beyla would say, well, you can cross the gender boundary when it's appropriate. There is something called approved boundary crossing. Glikl would talk about necessary boundary crossing. And Leah, the boundary should be permeable. You should be able to go back and forth. So here we have 3 women and how they contended with the conventional gender roles that they were assigned by the Jewish societies they lived in. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Moshe, for a fantastic talk. Sharon, do you want to take over from here, or do you want me to take
Yeah,
it?
sure.
Okay.
So
You're not
thank
visible.
you.
Turn your camera back on. Yeah.
Oh, sorry. Thank you, Moshe, for a inspiring talk, and I'm sure it's evoked much thought, many questions. So you can either, let's see if I see your screens, you can either ask the old-fashioned way, and I guess raise a hand and I'll try and find you. Or you can send in a question to Sharon Flato. So we opted to have you guys all on screen to make it feel more live time and not to hold a town hall where you don't see people. So for exactly this reason. So not surprisingly, Professor Mancia, an early modernist, is going to ask the first question. And I say that in a good way.
Thank you. Hi, Professor Rosman. Thank you so much for this talk. So there are a couple of students in this class who are in my medieval and early modern gender and sexuality class, which is taught in the history department and is sort of Europe-wide. And I'm just interested if you think there's something about these women that makes them particularly early modern. Is there a reason why they exist in the early modern period and not the medieval period? Is there something about that context that allows them to do this kind of thing that they couldn't do before, or maybe they could? Interested in that answer.
So, I'm sure you've had the experience of medievalists saying, oh, we have that too. Oh, we have that too. So anything that I've presented, businesswomen, lots of Jewish medieval businesswomen. Well, I'm sure that's true. The difference, I think, is here in quantity. And the fact that this is easily recovered in the sources, unlike the medieval sources, which are, you have to really hunt. But to answer what you really asked, first of all, printing, of course. Printing makes books available. It's interesting, Leah, who quotes in her little 8-page booklet more than a dozen sources, classic rabbinical sources, not one does she quote accurately, which tells us she was quoting from memory. Now, men also would quote from memory. It's not only women who would quote from memory, but it shows that she studied the books, but she didn't have a library handy. Glikl obviously read extensively. You can tell from all the different stories she brings. And if Beyla could teach these things, and her son tells us she would read the portion. So the fact that they could read is important. And then, of course, what's going on in Europe in the 16th, 17th century with revolution and communication and travel. When you read Glikl's book, there are no boundaries. There are no state boundaries. She travels from Holland almost to Poland. And that's never an issue. So, of course, they are women of their time. They're not, I guess Glikl lived in a ghetto, but the other two did not. Next.
So if it's quiet, I'll ask a question. It's a little bit of an unfair question, Moshe. You probably get this all the time. But it seems to me, especially in light of other work that you have done, where you are so skeptical of stories and, tales about them, people's tales about themselves. Here, you seem to be very accepting.
Credulous.
And especially the first source, we have one source, right? And that's the son praising his mother, who maybe is deceased. But I don't know,
Okay, look, forget the first slide, forget the praise. He brings facts. He tells us she did this, she did this, she did this. I don't think he's lying. It's not the same thing as a story, a fantastic story about somebody performing a miracle or something I heard from somebody else that
yeah, but there might be sort of a certain stock of phrases that you use. They prayed, they this, and You're not going to leave
the
one
stock
out. Or
phrases
he's not
are
lying, but
the stock phrases are in the first slide. But you know what? It doesn't. That's not the real point, though. My point was, what is the model? What is the model? Let's say she didn't do all of these things. That doesn't matter. It's what is the model in her time and place for what a woman should be like. What's the model for an exceptional woman?
Right.
Let's
And
say
then
she didn't do these things.
Right.
But here is the model. And in the final chart that I presented, so you see what that model is, which is different from the other two models.
right. So even that, the model, I was also going to say, to what extent do you have to take the context into consideration? So let's say Leah. Would Leah, who was clearly a traditional woman from a rabbinic family who married, would she really say that the expectations of women are the same as men? I mean,
She is.
I'm saying we have to understand that.
She doesn't mention the 3 mitzvot, the candle lighting, the challah, and the mikvah. She doesn't mention it.
Right, but she doesn't think women should be part of minyan. I'm saying within her context,
she's not a revolutionary. She is
traditional.
not a revolutionary, but neither was Mary Wollstonecraft. If you read Mary Wollstonecraft's book, she says, I do not come to revolutionize. I don't remember the exact word. I want to make women more virtuous. I want them to be better wives. I want them to be better daughters. She's very careful, and she's the mother of feminism. Well, you can't expect Leah to be more feminist than Mary Wollstonecraft. But her point is, look, it says in the Talmud, women are going to bring the redemption. How can they do that if they only have 3 mitzvot? And they don't. They have 411 mitzvot. You know, it's interesting. Another member.
But she's also, I mean, this is a homiletic, you know. There are also statements where men, that it says men will bring their, you know, I think she knows.
Yes,
she's a
of course.
sophisticated woman.
She knows
she's
that.
Not.
But she's, if you read it, she's obviously angry.
Right.
When she says, I'm not going to speak to dullards, I was quoting the book of Psalms. She's saying, look, I know this stuff. I know Torah. And as I said, she writes in Aramaic, I think. What's the point? It's to show I can do this, and I'm a woman. And if Rav Acha said women are going to bring redemption, how can that be? We have to be able to do something. And contrast that to Shlomo Ephraim of Lunchitz, who was another member of the all-time rabbinic all-star team, right? He wrote the famous commentary, the Kli Yakar. He says in one of his books, and as everybody knows, women are exempt from most of the mitzvot. That's not true. That was the ethos, that was the feeling. And that's what she's fighting against. No. What about all the negative commandments? So I think, obviously, she didn't, to use the word feminism is a terrible anachronism. I would never do that. But what she is saying is that women have an important role to play in this religion. Women deserve more cultural capital.
I don't have the ability to raise my hand on here, so I want to just make one announcement.
Okay, and then we see Lawrence Kaplan.
And then so that's one of my announcements is if you find the raise your hand feature on here, then we can know to unmute you. And then I have a couple of questions I want to ask, but I'll let Lawrence Kaplan ask his first. So let me get on here to unmute him. Sorry, if you raise your hand, then it brings it up to the top. Otherwise, I got to find you on the.
He did raise his hand.
No. You
I
have to
saw
raise
it.
it through the raise your hand feature, and then it brings it to the
Okay.
top. Otherwise, I have to scroll down and find you. Got it. I think I just allowed you to, Lawrence.
No, he's still on mute, I think.
Yes, but he's now able to unmute himself.
Okay.
So now he has to find the unmute feature that he has to find himself. It's on the left-hand corner of the bottom left of the screen.
So yeah, I'd like to just follow up with Sharon, particularly about Glikl memoir. So there, just the other day or the other week, Abe Socher interviewed Yehuda Reinhartz about Chaim Weissman, and they discussed his memoir. And basically, what Yehuda said was, if you check his memoir against all types of contemporaneous documents. A lot was exaggeration, some were complete lies, literally complete lies. Like he said about how after Kishinev, he went and he helped the Jews. There was a Weissman, except it was Weissman's brother, Moshe, not Chaim. So, I mean, the question is with Glikl, when she says, I say this not to praise myself, but of course she is praising herself. My husband consulted with me all the time. He never did anything without me. Well, I wonder if you would ask your husband whether he would say he really consulted with her.
Again, that's not the point.
Well,
that is not the point. The point is that she wants us to think that.
yeah, okay, but
She's
Yes.
not saying, I was the little woman at home and made sure that dinner was on the table every night. And that's what I did. That I washed my children's hair and I laundered their clothes like Beyla did. She doesn't tell us that to praise herself. The way she wants to praise herself, she wants us to think that. Whether it's true or not is not the point. She wants us to, that is her image of what a woman should be like. And on the other hand, the fact is, she did successfully marry off 8 children, which in those days was like sending 8 children to college. It's like if she paid tuition at a private university for 8 kids.
I think both are. I think, you know, how the person wants to be perceived is very important, as you say, but it also what the reality was, and the fact, I just think we have to take into account that the image that they present to a certain extent may correspond to the reality, to a certain extent may not. And with memoirs particularly, where it's hard to check.
Yes, it's
And when we
self-fashioning.
are able
We
to
know
check,
this.
we oftentimes know that things are just completely made up. We just have to be
Yes,
careful.
this is well established that autobiography is self-fashioning.
Right.
People
Self-fashioning, yeah.
are presenting to a public. They have a reader in mind, and they want to present a certain image. They want to defend themselves. That's all true. But that's my point is, what is the ideal woman for her? And she's telling us what the ideal woman is. Whether she was or not is not my concern at this point. I'm not writing a biography of Glikl. I'm talking about women's perception of their place in the society.
Can I follow up on that? Because that was one of my 2 questions. My first one was on that point that you seem to be tracing an arc of a change in thought about women and change in women's thought about themselves and their place in society through these 3. And are you making that argument as a larger argument of change that's happening in society?
No.
Or is it just these 3 that you happen to notice? And is there a temporal aspect to it, or do you want to take it any further than that or not?
I can't generalize, you know, that there was a wave of this kind of thinking going on, but I believe the margin tells you where the center is. And if we assume that these women were exceptional, Glikl, I'm not so sure how exceptional she was. There are, because we know of other women like her. But let's assume these women are exceptional. That's fine. If the margin is here, the center is here. If the margin is here, the center is here. And if Leah, her booklet was only reprinted once with the Hebrew introduction. It was reprinted many times, but without the introduction. Now the introduction is the most unconventional part. That's the part where she does most of her protesting. So obviously it wasn't accepted, and no group of women started organizing something in the spirit of what she wrote. No, but it's on the agenda, it's in the air, and it took 400 years to come to fruition.
You know, we have many students here today, so I'd like to encourage one of the students to speak.
Yeah, again, if you use your raise the hand feature, or even if you just turn on your camera and wave your hand, right, we should be able to see you. So, you know, if you turn on the video on the bottom near the left, either of those features and kind of wave in some way, I have to, you know, ask you to unmute, and then you have to unmute yourselves. So it's a 2-step process, but.
You're too intimidating, Moshe.
Maybe their teachers are intimidating.
I can ask another question that I had, which is just, my other question was to kind of help some of the, Ava, are you trying to ask a question by giving the thumbs up? You want me to?
Oh, yeah. Okay, good.
Is that, sorry. Sorry, that feature doesn't bring you to the top, which then, here we go. Ava, you should be able to unmute yourself now if that was what you were trying to do. I think maybe she was just giving the thumbs up. Okay, so Ava, you're welcome to jump in next if you want. But my follow-up question was simply, or not a follow-up, but my other question was simply, for our general audience here, I think some of these women may feel quite less than modern. And so I want you to kind of just help them kind of enter into what's the world that these women are living in, and where do their statements about themselves, or in the case of the first woman you brought, right, her son, where does that fit into that context? And is this, I don't know, just help them, I think, a little bit more with some.
Well, this is, look, they lived in classic patriarchal societies. Okay. Let's just take politics. Women could not be on the communal governing boards, whether we're talking about the Christian municipality or the Jewish kahal. Women have no political, at least formal political role, maybe behind the scenes. So right away, that takes away a tremendous amount of power. That power is in men's hands. Economically, now it's not true, as many people think, that in Jewish society, most of the men were full-time Talmud scholars and the wives had to support them. That is false. Very few men were full-time scholars. And in most couples, the man and the woman worked, with the man usually being the senior partner and the woman the junior partner. So if the man was a shoemaker, his wife assisted him. If they had an inn, the man was the outside person, making sure they had supplies and negotiating with the authorities. And the woman was the one who greeted the customers and prepared the food and made the beds and looked after the belongings. So the men were in charge. And plus, the idea that a woman's primary role is to take care of the home and the children, this was taken for granted. None of these women, these three women, would have objected to that. They all believed in that. Glikl emphasizes, don't think that is of secondary importance. That's very important. But she did it, and she would have endorsed it.
Thank you, that's helpful.
Along Professor Brodsky's line, could you also elaborate a little bit on what you think women's girls' education look like?
Oh, okay. First, Glikl tells us that she did attend school briefly. I don't know how common that was. Certainly, it may have been more common in the West than the East, that is in the German-speaking areas than in Poland. As a rule, girls, if they were taught at home by a relative or a private teacher. So their mother, their grandmother, their uncle, their aunt, their brother, their father, someone would teach them basically how to read, so that they could read in Yiddish, their language. But not all women even were taught how to read, but they could listen to the books being read to them. So for example, the all-time bestseller, the Tzena, which is a Yiddish retelling of the Bible with the basic stories of the Bible, but including the rabbinic midrashim, the rabbinic interpretations of those stories, so that anybody who reads or listens to Tzena knows how a Jew understands the Bible through rabbinic eyes. So if on a Friday night at the dinner table or after dinner, the father or the mother is reading Tzena, so both the boys and the girls can hear it, can listen. And but if we don't know what percentage of women could read, we don't know. It wasn't 10%, it wasn't 90%. If I had to guess, I would say it's probably about 50%. But in the synagogue, there was a Zogerke who would say the prayer in Yiddish, and women would repeat it or just cry. So, but women's education was informal, whereas boys' education was formal. On the other hand, boys had to learn a foreign language, Hebrew, and if they continued to a higher level, another foreign language, Aramaic. Girls could, if we put it this way, boys studied, girls read or listened to reading, because they could read books in their own language. And in the beginning of the 16th century, a Yiddish library developed, which in many ways was parallel to the learned Hebrew books, but in a popular idiom, so that women would know, what does a Jew believe? How does a Jew behave?
We have a question from Ava. Were these women able to receive an education and ability to market, sell, etc., because of the fact that they were married or through their husbands?
I didn't understand.
I'm not sure. Well, I think they're.
Would they have received enough of an education to be able to work in the market? I guess record.
Well, obviously Glikl
records.
did. Yes. Well, the market is shared. Women are active in the marketplace without question. If I said politics is the men, the marketplace is a shared space, men and women, when we're talking about Jewish women. So but women are usually on the lower end of the market. We have several bylaws of the Vara Baratzot, the Council of Four Lands, which was the national governing body of Polish Jews in the 17th and 18th century, trying to regulate women peddlers who go house to house selling, which means, first of all, they had to have basic arithmetic. They probably had to be able to read, and they had to be able to speak the vernacular. They had to speak some Polish in order to sell to the people in the villages. Women had stands in the marketplace. There are women who had stores. And then the whole subject of widows who continue the business like Glikl did. And she was an international merchant, but the more typical is women who the husband has a store or an inn, and they continue it after he dies. And they have to have some education to be able to do that.
Okay, I'm looking at the hour. I think we're going to wrap up. Thank you. Thank you, Moshe. We all look forward to, I don't want to say part 2 because it's a completely different lecture, but the next lecture by Professor Rosman, same time, same place, same day, next Wednesday. I guess 12:30 our time, 7:30 your time, Moshe?
Yes.
Okay, so for
And the
those of you,
title? And the title of that talk, Professor Flato?
Pardon?
the title of the talk, I'm saying this by heart, so I'm probably going to misquote, is the historical Baal Shem Tov.
Well, it's the Baal Shem Tov and the beginnings of Hasidism. Baal Shem Tov and the beginnings of Hasidism.
Okay, thank you so much. We really
Okay.
appreciate that you came. Thank you.
Thank you.
And David's going to end the meeting. If you have further questions for Professor Rosman, you can send them to me or to David.
Okay, thank you all for coming.